Che Guevara has become an icon of a generation of youth fighting against what they perceive as the status quo. His face is on billboards, jewelry, and t-shirts. And even those who do not know the history of Che can confidently claim that Che was for the people. His death is shrouded by scandal, his life marred by hardships that are not fathomable by the general population. He was and is perceived a demon to some, and to others he is a face of an ideology. Through all the turmoil, Che considered and proved himself a guerrilla revolutionary soldier. Che described being a guerrilla as the highest stage of humankind, someone who is prepared to sacrifice himself for ideals, in this case the ideals of Marxist-Leninism. The solution that he called the solution to mankind's ills. The only way to turn around the world from what he called, dominated by what he called Yankee capitalism. Che is born Ernesto Guevara de la Serna on May 14th, 1928. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, in the city of Rosario, Argentina. He was born in an upper middle class family and the oldest of his 4 siblings. It is noted by his younger friends that he played with all the neighborhood children, his neighbors and their servants' children as well, showing that he was both empathetic and attuned to equality, even in these younger stages of his life. Unfortunately, he suffered from asthma from a young age, and it lingered throughout his life, prompting his family to move to the dry town of Altagracia in hopes of limiting his symptoms. Their childhood friends remember that he had very distinctive traits. For one, he was a terrible dancer with no ear for music. Another, and probably the most stark, is that he had a horrible hygiene habit, often wearing 1 shirt a week, which he called the weekly shirt. The last is he was described as a womanizer, to a point that many historians now label him a hypersexual, seducing women regardless of age, shape, or appearance. Despite his unusual antics, Ernesto was a very inquisitive and bright child, reading often well above his peers' level. Authors such as Nehru, Gandhi, Mussolini, and Steinbeck. Ernesto enrolls in medical school, but before he finishes, he sets off on a South American tour with his friend Alberto Grinaldo on an old motorbike. There they travel down south through Patagonia and off into Chile, where their bike breaks down and they're forced to essentially hitchhike, walk, etc., and decide to visit what it was at that time the world's largest open pit copper mine called Chiquicamata, which at that time held a certain stigma for Latin Americans as a monstrous beacon of American capitalism, exploiting the labor force. Companies such as Kinka and Anaconda, which of course were there for cheap labor and cheap materials. Seeing this, Ernesto is appalled at the conditions that the workers are in, and really gets his first taste of poverty coming from such a privileged upbringing. This was, for all intents and purposes, attuned Che to the suffering of his people. From Chile, Alberto and Ernesto continue north through Peru and Colombia and on into Venezuela, where Alberto decides to stay, and Ernesto promptly returns home to finish medical school, but now with a social conscience. After graduating school, Ernesto goes to Bolivia, where he begins to meet other young idealists, many of whom are students who invite Ernesto to see Guatemala, which at that time, under President Arbenz, was attempting to enact basically social land reform from the unused land of the United Fruit Companies. Unfortunately, the United Fruit Companies leadership had very close ties with the Eisenhower administration, both through deals and through actual familial ties. The high-ranking members of the CIA and one of the corporate leaders of the United Fruit Company were brothers, and as such, the United Fruit Company was able to persuade the U.S. to be worked up into a fervor about communism spreading to the poor, small country of Guatemala. This charged atmosphere, under American pressure, was how Ernesto first sets foot in Guatemala, and thus strengthening his ideals on American capitalism and imperialism. It is here in Guatemala that Ernesto meets a woman that will become his first wife, Hilda Gildea. And it is Hilda that introduces Ernesto to the followers of a 26-year-old lawyer named Fidel Castro. At this point, Castro was known as in revolutionary circles for leading an attack on the Moncada barracks, which at that time was the second largest barracks in Cuba, in an attempt to overthrow the current president, Fulgencio Batista, along with other students and organized workers. By 1954, the political unrest in Guatemala, because of the political unrest in Guatemala, the U.S. pressured President Arbenz to step down, which he did, and Castillo Armez is placed in power. Though seen as many as an American puppet, which he is, he begins quickly to hunt down communists and members of the old regime. Quickly, Che finds himself as a target for either arrest or execution, and wisely leaves the country. He does so, bringing two things with him: a newfound contempt for America and his Marxist ideals, which he learned from the followers of Fidel Castro, many of whom were Marxist students. One commentator puts it very well when he says, Ernesto Guevara leaves Guatemala a very radicalized individual looking for a revolution to fight in. From Guatemala, Ernesto, following the example of many other leftists, head to Mexico City, where the president, Cardenas, had nationalized the oil fields 24 years prior. Here he meets up with the followers of Fidel, and finally meets Raul Castro, who Ernesto quickly befriends on Marxist platforms. Raul at this point was already a Marxist. Fidel is not. And Fidel is also still in prison for the attack on the Moncada military base. Ernesto looks to Raul as an inspiration, someone who, despite the odds, has launched a dictatorship-toppling attack on a military base, had served 22 months in a prison for it, and was now back in Mexico trying to build an army to try again. The brashness really spoke to Ernesto's character, and I think it's what really drew him to the movement. After 2 years and a lot of pressure from the Cuban people, Batista finally releases Fidel, and who quickly heads to Mexico to presumably regain control of his forces in Mexico. It is in 1955 that Ernesto and Fidel finally meet in an all-night meeting. After this meeting, they realize they share many of the same goals and certainly some of the common enemies. In the United States and in imperialism. Ernesto was quickly invited to join the July 26 movement, which is named after the date that Fidel and the men attacked the barracks. And he signs on as a troop doctor. This is his first case of receiving the nickname Che. Che, an informal Argentinian greeting, essentially meaning "hey you." As the only non-Cuban and as an Argentinian, the nickname suits him well. Hilde, whom, if you remember, first introduced Che to the members of the July 26 movement, had remained in Guatemala because she had not been a political target, and now heads to Mexico to meet and be with Che with a small surprise. She was pregnant at this time. Che made the choice to do the right thing and married Hilde after she got there. But the birth of his daughter put his revolutionary ideas on hold, but after the birth of his daughter Hildita, Che puts all of his efforts into the movement in a preparation for an attack on Cuban soil. He and the members of the July 26 movement retreat to a large ranch on the outskirts of Mexico City, where they begin to train both with firearms and in survival tactics. Quickly, Che proves that he is one of the best shots in the camp and gains a small reputation for being a good soldier. Unfortunately, at some point, the fact that they're training gets out to the Mexican government, and they are all arrested, including Fidel, Che, and many other members of the July 26 movement. They're held for only a month, and as soon as they're released, they take their movement underground. At this point, Fidel buys a boat that he aptly names the Grandma, and Che writes his final goodbyes to his mother, wife, and daughter with the request that Hilde deliver them upon his death. November 25th, 1955, 82 men board the Grandma, and Che writes in his journal, "By 1956, we shall be free or we shall be martyrs."